presenter tonight, Margot from Port Clyde, Maine, and she's an author and she's a supporter of the Good Life Center, and I think we're in for a very interesting time tonight. So, welcome.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you coming out tonight and staying in this hot room for a little while. I will try and make it entertaining. I've been working on a book about folks who make the decision to go back to the land beginning in 1840 and going all the way up to the young farmers who are coming back to the land and farming organically right now. And because of that, learning more about Scott and Helen Nearing was going to be central to this task. Part of my learning about them, because unlike many of you, I didn't have the chance to know them, involved going to their archives and taking a look at the material there. At the Walden Woods Archive down in Lincoln, Mass., one of the things that I was especially eager to look at was a manuscript for a novella that Scott Nearing had written in 1913 under the pseudonym Max Worth. And the reason I was curious about this novella is that even though he spent a decade of summers at Arden, it gets pretty short shrift in the research about him. Rebecca Gould, who some of you may know or know of, wrote about it in her book, At Home in Nature, but other places there's not very much information about it at all. So I was interested, because of the kind of place that Arden was, to find out how important it was to his development, to his thinking about the good life. In order to do that, I did the research to learn about Arden and about how it came to be and what its values were. And then I kind of ground truthed the novella against that to see how much of a crossover there was between the way he was representing it and the way that its founders had imagined it. So tonight what I'll do is I'll talk for a little while about the development of Arden as a community, and then I'll switch to look at a lot of passages from the novella so that you can get a sense of what he thought, at least in 1913, about his experiences there. So in June of 1895, about a dozen Philadelphians carrying knapsacks and dressed in the blue flannel shirts and brown pants of the Union Army descended on Wilmington, Delaware. They'd come to urge residents to vote for candidates who supported what was called Henry George's single tax in the November 1896 election. The group was mostly members of the Philadelphia Single Tax Society. They were incredibly persistent and well organized. They managed to hold 469 meetings in just 4 months. They had a message they truly believed would resonate. They thought that if Delaware would just change its tax code to be a single tax applied only to land ownership, then it would become incredibly prosperous and it would be a model for the entire nation. Henry George, the man behind this plan, was not trained as an economist. He developed his theories while trying to make sense of what he called the great enigma of our times. And that enigma is the fact that the more a society creates wealth, the more that society also generates poverty. In his words, the tramp comes with the locomotive, and almshouses and prisons are as surely the marks of material progress as are costly dwellings, rich warehouses, and magnificent churches. That economic progress should invariably include increasing strife seemed both illogical and immoral to him. And so, quote, he made a vow that he would never rest until he had found the cause of, and, if he could, the remedy for, this deepening poverty amid advancing wealth. The hypothesis that he eventually reached is really quite straightforward. He believed that land speculation is the root of economic inequality, and that a tax policy that doesn't reward speculation would reduce the wealth gap. Most of the economists of his era believed otherwise, with the exception of Marx, who hadn't yet been translated into English. Most of the economists thought a rising economic tide would lift all boats, that material progress would enhance the lives of rich and poor alike. George was absolutely sure that wouldn't work. He pointed out that the new efficiencies in manufacturing, the advent of labor-saving devices, and other artifacts of increasing industrialization were operating like an immense wedge that was being, quote, forced through society. Those who are above the point of separation are elevated, but those who are below are crushed down. George predicted that this gap would continue to widen if the system didn't change, that it would make sharper the contrast between the house of have and the house of want. So a quick side note. If this sounds really familiar, it's because it is. By 1890, when Henry George was talking, 9% of Americans controlled 71% of the wealth. In 2017, 10% of Americans controlled 77% of the wealth. Only 15% compared to the 75% live below the poverty line now. However, because the top 1% controls 40% of the wealth, the perception of the other 90% is that they live in a much more bifurcated state. So, quickly back to Henry. So, Henry George laid out these ideas in a book entitled Progress and Poverty. It quickly became an international bestseller. It was translated into a dozen languages. Paperback editions printed in the US and in England outsold popular novels. In fact, in the 1890s, Progress and Poverty sold more copies overall than any other book except the Bible. It's still in print today. So let's dig in a little bit to get at his ideas. So, his idea was that landowners would pay an annual sum, a single tax, to the municipality or the state or the nation. That money would pay for essential goods and services, just like any tax theoretically does. The crucial difference is that no distinction would be made in the tax rate between improved land and unimproved land. Because 1,000 acres held aside would be taxed at the same level as 1,000 acres on which people were living and presumably paying the landlord rent, or on which crops were being cultivated and presumably sold, it would no longer make sense to hoard land. As more land would, in theory, be put to its best use, wage earners would also benefit, increasing the well-being of those at all levels of the economic ladder. A lower cost of living would allow laborers to keep more of their earnings. Narrowing economic inequality in this way would not really hurt the wealthy, who had more than they needed, but it would help the poor quite a bit, and it would ensure the continued existence of a middle class. Sensible as this sounds, the advocates of the single tax have rarely prevailed. The single taxers who converged on Delaware were unable to persuade the Delawareans to vote for their candidates. Only 3% of them voted for the single tax candidates. Two of the folks who were disappointed that this happened were artists who were also prominent members of the Philadelphia single tax community, an architect named Will Price and a sculptor named Frank Stevens. Stevens read Progress and Poverty in 1886, not long after it had come out, and it resonated with him deeply. He said, when I discovered that it really was a possibility to abolish poverty and all the ugliness and suffering that comes with it, then everything else in my life seemed unimportant. What is other beauty compared with that created by right conditions? So when Will Price approached him about creating what he called a living Georgist laboratory, Stevens jumped at the chance. In the spring of 1900, they found a 162-acre farm just outside Wilmington, Delaware. Close to an active railroad line, the land was easily accessible not only to the folks from Wilmington, but also to those from Philadelphia. Stevens, who was an avid Shakespearean, and it tipped of the hat to the forest in As You Like It, which, as you may know, is an anarchic space where characters can be free from social mores. So in honor of that forest, he dubbed the new village Arden. In addition to their commitment to the single tax, Stevens and Price were influenced by Transcendentalism and by the British arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement had begun in England a few decades earlier and was gaining momentum in the US in the 1890s. Arts and crafters believed that by focusing on the design of household items, artisans might reanimate a desire for a simple life enhanced by beautiful, durable objects made of natural materials. William Morris is perhaps the best known practitioner, and he proposed a design golden rule. Have nothing in your houses that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. William Price had discovered Morris's work and ideas when he traveled to England searching for architectural inspiration. He immediately and viscerally connected with Morris's ideas that art and daily life should be more closely intertwined, and that handcrafted items were superior to machine-made goods. This wasn't snobbery, or at least not solely snobbery. Morris believed that working in factories was soul-crushing, and that it left people alienated from their own labor. Artisans, in contrast, had control over the whole process of making an item, and so that control enabled them to have an enlivening experience. Morris also believed that if he could just recreate the medieval guild system, then there would also be a work environment. There would also be a work environment that would be far better for people than life in the cities. As his own philosophy evolved, Price melded Morris's ideas with some from early American Transcendentalism. This mesh was made easy because arts and crafts already incorporated a lot of ideas from Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, two important thinkers in America. For his part, Frank Stevens was influenced early on by transcendental philosophy, especially by Emerson. As an adult in art school, he encountered British arts and crafts ideas, and the movement's emphasis on decorative arts was so appealing to him that he and some of his fellow alumni began what became a very successful decorative arts business. So from the foundation, Arden had a single tax, a belief that everyone should have work that was ennobling, and a deep attention to art and aesthetics. The precise strain of arts and crafts thinking that contributed to Price's and Stevens' vision was a desire not simply to create beautiful objects, but to make available a whole life experience for residents. And this life experience was to be rooted in an egalitarian, pre-industrial, creative, and communal culture. As Frank Stevens explained, we had learned William Morris's truth, that nothing can be done for art until we have bridged the terrible gulf between rich and poor. We were so disgusted with civilization that we determined then and there to go out into the open and make a better one. At first, this community of Arden looked more like a makeshift campground than like a self-sufficient community. Though even from its noble earliest days, a graceful arch bearing the placard, "You are welcome hither," adorned the entrance style. On its verse, departing residents read the farewell message, "If we do meet again, why, we shall smile," a line from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Among the early residents, all of whom overlapped with Scott Nearing's time there, were the labor organizer Ella Reeve Bloor, the muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair, Lizzie McGee, who's best known for having created the board game Monopoly, and the vagabond poet Harry Kemp. Within less than a decade, Arden made the transition from thrown-together summer colony to well-thought-out year-round community. William Price understood the ways in which living arrangements could be made to promote or discourage various behaviors, and so he sought to create an environment that promoted behaviors he saw as an antidote to mainstream society. Chief among them were de-emphasizing private spaces and emphasizing public ones. The master plan he created included 2 village greens, small house lots, ample communal space, meandering roads, and outdoor areas that encouraged lingering. His first early outdoor emendations were damming part of a creek to create a swimming hole and building circular seats around the big trees in the woodland that edged the village. The residents established a variety of guilds, a tip of the hat to the medieval guilds and a borrowing from arts and crafts movement. The ones at Arden were focused on constructive fun. The earliest were an athletics guild, a craftsman's guild, a musician's guild, and a scholars guild. From the get-go, Shakespearean plays were produced at least once a year, and the town created its own holidays, held annual pageants and fairs, and organized its government via town meeting. Arden benefited in part from its location, Because it was a half-hour train ride from Philly, it took advantage of the culture in Philly, which was particular in this moment in American history. It was home not only to a thriving single-tax community, but also to an ethical culture club, active artist groups, and many skilled laborers. An array of creative and socially active Philadelphians quickly came to regard Arden as an oasis, a place to spend weekends or vacations with kindred spirits. And Philly retained an appreciation of the trades longer than almost all other industrialized cities, such that even the children of the elite families were expected to learn a trade before embarking on a profession. An aspiring engineer, for example, might learn the skills of a machinist first, while a budding architect would likely learn carpentry. Thus, in a situation that's different than that in many other utopian communities, many of the early residents of Arden came actually knowing an array of essential skills. Thanks to their know-how and their work ethic, the residents quickly traded their tents for cottages that they helped one another raise. A decade into the new century, Arden's broad village green was abutted by not only a gaggle of small homes and cottages, but also by a forge, an ice cream parlor, an outdoor theater, a hotel, a community center, shops, a tennis court, and a baseball diamond. Scott Nearing's one-room cabin, Forest Lodge, was situated on a half-acre that he rented for $13 a year. And it was very much a summer-only dwelling. Upton Sinclair, who was Scott's neighbor for quite a few years, had a house next door called Jungalow. It was eventually a year-round house, but he didn't stay there long. Almost all dwellings were surrounded by gardens that the residents tended themselves. Stevens noted that many of the early residents rented small plots and raised truck to be hauled to the markets of Wilmington. Here's Scott at the garden at Jungalow. Frank Stevens stressed that agricultural prowess was something that all Ardenites cultivated. Everyone is to some extent a tiller of the soil, as it was in that picturesque medieval life which came from an underlying early communal land tenure on which our system is an improvement. Scott Nearing was no exception. He described his bread labor in contact with nature as one of the things he especially appreciated about his time at Arden. Price advocated for an architecture that emphasized simplicity and beauty and that relied as much as possible on local materials, using oak and poplar wood from Sherwood Forest and Arden Woods, as well as the field stones that were plentiful there. Relying on what was at hand made the buildings more integrated into the landscape and had the advantage of being, as Price noted, cheap, easily attainable, and beautiful. The early Ardenites did not want to be slaves to their homes. They preferred to be free of domestic responsibility in order to pursue their artistic, dramatic, or literary pursuits. So, even without having looked at the novella, I suspect many of you are recognizing some of the Arden values that Scott Nearing held dear. Like Stevens and Price and other Ardenites, Scott believed in the importance of growing his own food, spending a lot of time in nature, using local materials for building construction, not being a slave to one's property, creating constructive forms of personal entertainment, and minimizing necessary labor in order to make time for other pursuits. Now, let's turn to the novella. The first time I began reading this manuscript, I found myself thinking about the scene in Being John Malkovich, when Malkovich goes through the portal into his own brain, if any of you remember that, and everyone he encounters looks just like him. In Ardentown, Nearing parts out his own traits onto all of the main characters. The protagonist is Fred Allen, quote, a brilliant young businessman full of noble impulses, end quote. He gets Scott's looks. Arden's philosophy, which we already sense has a lot in common with Scott's, is channeled by the suffragette Ruth Wade, an artist, a girl of 25, who is physically modeled on Nellie Seeds, Scott's then wife. Another Ardenite, Sam Martin, shares Scott's vocation and avocation. Nicknamed the Professor, Sam teaches Fred to use mulches and manures to replenish depleted soil. And on Thursday nights, he regales Ardenites with lectures on economics. And perhaps most importantly, Will Evans, who is described as the spirit of the place, offers the most trenchant commentary that sounds like Scott would later in his life. So when this story opens, Fred is all but engaged to a Miss Treat, but quickly grows intrigued by Ruth, whom he meets when she joins her cousin, an old friend of Fred's, for a vacation at the Jersey Shore. Actually, he's more than intrigued, as you can see from the passage that's on the page, on the screen. One thing was borne in upon him with irresistible force. He could not escape her. He might disapprove or expostulate or worship, but surely he could not ignore. Of medium height, in the flower of her young womanhood, Ruth Wade was a person at whom one would look at least twice. She was tastily dressed in the latest fashion, yet the style was so modified that it became her, as if it had been created for her alone. From under her wavy golden brown hair, her glance came so brilliant and fearless that he almost feared to meet it. What might this encounter presage? What indeed? During the train ride from Philly to the shore, Ruth talks a blue streak. She schools Fred in macroeconomics, in the need for women's suffrage, and in the importance of maintaining a commitment to aesthetics in all aspects of one's life, even business. By the time they reach their destination, Fred reflects that, quote, "She has turned me inside out, but I am not at all sorry," end quote. Although Miss Treat is at the same hotel, Fred finds himself so captivated by Ruth that he largely ignores his almost fiancée. A few days into the vacation, Fred and Ruth head out for a sunrise sail. As the sun begins to burn off the morning haze and break through the clouds, Ruth tells Fred that they remind her of home. Quote, "They are hurrying up toward the sun to shut it in. They are like the interests which are opposed to the fullness of liberty in life. All about us they have gathered, shutting us in. Down at Arden, we try to dispel the clouds and let the sun shine. We seek to break the spell of the long years of unfairness and wrong, because we know that behind the clouds of selfishness is the sun of human virtue and nobleness." When, a few minutes later, she starts to embark on another semi-lecture, this one on class divisions, Fred changes the subject by asking her about life at Arden. She tells him, "It is suffused with a wonderful atmosphere which makes the grass a little greener, the sky a little bluer, and the stars a little brighter than they are anywhere else. One feels Arden." Fred remarks that it must be a wonderful place, to which Ruth says, "It is wonderful, Mr. Allen, but it isn't a place." Fred teases her, asking if Arden is located anywhere, thereby introducing the idea of Arden as a utopia. Ruth waxes on about their sylvan community, insisting that we grow in all ways into nobler selves, and Fred continues to express doubt. "Aren't people just the same there as anywhere else?" he asks, adding that human nature hasn't changed much as far back as we have any record. Ruth assures him that, yes, people are just the same at Arden as elsewhere, naturally decent and honest. They are always that way if you give them a chance to be. She directly attributes this kind neighborliness to their adherence to Henry George's single tax philosophy. When Fred tells her that that doesn't make any sense to him, she assures him that no one can understand it until he has been there. Everyone expects everyone else to be honest, and they are. That is all. It is the spirit of the place. We are all comrades. If one is in trouble, the rest help out. If one is happy, the rest join in the jubilee. Each tries to do as much as he can for the rest, and the whole place is a beehive of industry, cooperative, mutually helpful. We are all on an equality in Arden. That is why the place breathes so much into our souls.